Hi everybody. So the purpose of this video is to review 10 moral theories and to try to explain how they can be used to make moral decisions and to make moral judgments and of course to make moral arguments, by which we want to follow the logical progression of a few ideas and to see whether we can draw a conclusion from those premises. So I'll take an example of something that I noticed a couple of years back. And it was just, I saw somebody coming out of a store and they were walking across a parking lot, and there was a little bit of a grass median at one point in the parking lot. And the person was opening a candy bar and just simply dropped the wrapper on the ground. And it happened to land on that grassy median between the storefronts and the parking spaces. So the person just simply littered. And I want to use that as the primary example for as kind of like the case by which I will unfold these moral theories. The first thing to mention is probably a point that David Hume made in the mid-1700s, the mid-18th century, that the observation of a fact or a sequence of events as a set of facts does not necessarily imply any kind of value judgment about it. This is the famous fact-value kind of discrepancy or dilemma, the is versus ought dilemma. So David Hume pointed out that, and he has a very compelling reason to do this, that when we are looking at something, we're just taking the facts. You could think about, for example, a police report. The police have to just kind of state what happened or the events or what people actually said in some cases, so or did, and those are facts. Now Hume challenges us to analyze those facts and to see whether at any point we can really get a justified moral fact from that. Are there any moral facts in what happened? And Hume argues there don't seem to be any moral facts. There are matters of fact that have to do with the sequence of events, but there are not necessarily any kind of ought. There's not any sort of should there that emerges. All right, so David Hume argued that emotions then come from, that morals come from our emotions, right? It's the fact that when I saw the person littering, that I had an emotional reaction to that told me that, hey, that's wrong of the person to do that. So Hume thought that this is the case for generally all morality. All of our morality comes from our emotional reactions to things that happen around us. And so we will emotionally say, that's wrong, right? All right, now this is the beginning of a discussion about what are sometimes called non-cognitive theories of morality, non-cognitive, because they rely much more on affect or emotional response, right, or on personal response, without accountability to logical consistency, So we're going to review some of the non-cognitive moral theories, and then we're going to switch to the cognitive moral theories. The non-cognitive moral theories are sometimes called authoritarian moral theories because they rely on some kind of central authority which we just kind of accept without necessarily a whole lot of criticism or challenge. So those non-cognitive or moral theories, I'll use those to assess the littering, right? So one of them we could start with subjectivism. Subjectivism is a non-cognitive moral theory that makes me the authority, me as the subject. So if I declare that something is wrong, then it's wrong, right? Okay, so if I subjectively say, oh, I think that littering is wrong, that I've made it wrong. All right, now, remember, with the non-cognitive moral theories, the challenge is that they tend to lack consistency. And certainly with subjectivism, there's a great deal of inconsistency. So for example, if I think that it's wrong, if I say that whatever's wrong for me is wrong, well then, is it the case then that whatever's wrong for that other person or right for that other person is right for them? We would have to grant that. Well, there are lots of situations, that basically eliminates any capacity, any competence that I might have to challenge anybody else's moral view. I have no ability to do that. I can't call anything that anybody else does immoral as long as they believe that it's moral. So in a sense, subjectivism fails as soon as it gets off the ground. It's a non-cognitive moral theory that is really impossible to implement or even impossible to argue for because of its severe lack of consistency. All right, so next let's go to another non-cognitive moral theory, also an authoritarian moral theory, which is cultural relativism. This is the idea that something is wrong when my culture, the cultural framework in which I live, declares it to be wrong. Or something is right or acceptable when my culture declares it to be right. Okay, well, we live in a culture, by and large, where we would say littering is wrong. So by that standard, littering is wrong. However, we can think of lots of exceptions, probably too many exceptions to this, that defeat the moral theory of cultural relativism. If we say that whatever our culture deems to be morally right is right, that means we have to accept that whatever any given culture, any other culture says is morally right, is right under that culture. That means we are justifying then, say, and let's go ahead, let's see how much time this video is almost 6 minutes. So 6 minutes to Hitler, right? So it's always interesting how much time it takes for somebody to use Hitler, who we generally would all agree did something that was absolutely horrible, or at least ordered people to do something, a systematic sweeping campaign that is absolutely atrocious. Um, well, if we accept cultural relativism, then if Nazi culture said that something is okay, then that makes it okay because that culture said so. We can think of many, many other examples of this. Take, for example, antebellum slavery in the American South, right? That is something that was culturally acceptable during that time and in that region. Does that make it okay? Would we want to say that slavery is okay as long as the culture says it is? Of course, we would object to that. Another problem with cultural relativism that sometimes people bring up is that it means that any attempt to change culture would automatically be morally wrong because what culture says is morally right. So to try to change that would be to suggest that culture was wrong, but then that would be a contradiction. So again, we're lacking consistency with a lot of these non-cognitive moral theories. All right, finally, the last non-cognitive / authoritarian moral theory I want to talk about or mention, maybe briefly, is what we sometimes call divine command theory. Divine command theory simply says that if my religion or my faith tradition says that something is morally wrong, then it's morally wrong, right? Okay, but again, of course, it's pretty clear why this is an authoritarian moral theory. We are taking some kind of authority, our religion, or God, if we want to accept that, and we are allowing that to set moral standards for our society. All right, so what might be some of the challenges with that? Well, first of all, it's based on the interpretation of some kind of scripture. You'll notice there are a lot of people who are very committed adherents of a particular religion who might disagree deeply over the interpretation of their scriptures such that they might end up at very different moral positions on something. So there's an interpretation difficulty. Also, divine command theory, it allows us to affix a let's see, how do I put this? This is the point in a video or in a script description where my brain glitches, right? It also it suggests that if we hold to a certain kind of religious tradition in the past and we say that that is what's morally right, well, what if things change? What if we decide that we now want to interpret our religion differently? Oh yeah, so again, we are with the same problem. We have a consistency problem because that means that our moral interpretation of Scripture could never change. Because if it changes, that means, well, is it moral now after the change? Or was it moral then before the change? In which case we shouldn't change it. So with divine command theory, with the idea that morality descends from our religious faith, we have from one moment to the next, or from one period to the next, a problem when we are locked into a kind of moral framework that really just characterizes one period of time. There's no space for moral progress religiously if we adopt divine command theory. All right, 9 minutes in, we've got more moral theories to go. Next, we'll move into the non-cognitive, or to the cognitive moral theories. And the reason why we call these cognitive is because they really do they embrace some kind of principle that can be consistently applied, right, across all the cases that we might examine. I forgot to continue to circle back to the case that I was initially offering, the case of the person littering. I'll keep doing that, or I'll resume doing that. So if we reject divine command theory, right, the idea that our religion sets morality, and instead say that it should be the other way around, it's our moral framework that should guide our interpretation of religion, well, we might use something that is sometimes called natural law. moral theory, natural law moral theory. Natural law is simply the idea that something is morally right if it conforms to or aligns with the natural order of things, right? Fairly simply. This moral theory was first kind of developed by Thomas Aquinas during the medieval period, and he argued that quite simply that if something follows the natural order, it's morally right. If something opposes the natural order, it's morally wrong. So now, how about some details about the natural order? What exactly are we talking about? Well, we learn this from nature. What does nature do? Nature um, Nature insists on its own survival, right? Things in life, animals, our overall ecosystem, things are trying to survive, right? So in natural law, if something promotes survival, then it's morally right. If something opposes survival, it's morally wrong. What else does nature do? Nature reproduces. So in natural law theory, whatever promotes reproduction is morally right. Whatever stops reproduction is morally wrong. And as you can imagine, people who adopt moral or natural law theory oppose things like abortion or euthanasia in most cases because abortion stops the reproductive process and, to take it a step further, ends a life. Right? Same with euthanasia. Right? So the idea that one could end somebody's life if they are experiencing unbearable suffering. Well, that ends a life. It stops survival. Right? Another element of natural law theory is that it also promotes growth. Right? So growth and growth, survival, reproduction. Those are all the things that are good, and stopping those are things that are bad. Okay, now let's go to our littering example, right? Is littering acceptable or unacceptable under natural law theory? Well, we might say that dropping a piece of plastic, a candy wrapper on the ground, well, that's going to harm the environment. It's going to stop growth in some ways. Now, granted, it's only like a grassy median in the middle of a parking lot, so it's not that much of a specific problem. But we still might say that adding a polymer like plastic to the ecosystem, it stops growth, right? It hinders growth. We could say that. There are probably other more sophisticated and responsible ways of using natural law theory to challenge littering, but let's move on. So another moral theory is called it's a kind of a set of moral theories called social contract moral theories. Social contract moral theories say that in order for us to cooperate, in order for us to collaborate in a society without killing each other, right, or without committing immoral acts against each other, we all have to mutually agree. Now, sometimes this agreement is implicit. In other words, sometimes we never actually outwardly say that we agree to this or consent to this. However, it's implied by our behavior. It's implied by our participation in a society that has a certain set of laws or a certain kind of government. So social contract says that we are all part of this contractual agreement where we respect each other's rights. And we even sacrifice some of our own rights, for example, my right to litter in a parking lot, for the sake of other people's rights. Right? There's a kind of like this transactional model of rights with social contract moral theories. So one of the earliest proponents of social contract moral theory was Thomas Hobbes. And Thomas Hobbes argued that in the state of nature, when there's no government or no moral framework, no set of rules or laws for us to follow, then we are in a condition, Hobbes argued, where resources are scarce enough that we will end up fighting, that we will end up trying to hoard as much as we possibly can in order to survive. Well, and we end up with a kind of like game theory model where it's to our advantage to steal or to hurt or sometimes even to murder when there is no government, no large central body, either of one person or of a group of people, to kind of make sure that we are all following these rules to which we have committed in a social contract. Right? That's social contract moral theory. So I might easily say then a person who's littering is violating the person's social contract because simply it's against the law. We've all kind of mutually agreed that these are going to be our laws. This is our municipality. These are our principles, and here are the fines for it, and so forth. Right? All right. So that's social contract theory. Another moral theory is sometimes called natural rights moral theory, and one early proponent of this was John Locke. John Locke argued that everybody has, as something that stems automatically from our humanity, the right to life. Our very first, most fundamental right is the right to be alive. Our second most fundamental right is the right to be free. And now that right to be free, the right of liberty, is crucial because without liberty, then life has very little meaning. That first right has very little meaning. And of course, without the right to life, liberty has no meaning as well, right? And finally, Locke argued that our third natural right is a right to property. And this makes absolute sense because we need property in order for us to live. And we need property. Property is a part of our liberty. Liberty means nothing if we cannot acquire for ourselves property. Now, of course, by property, we mean anything that we might draw into ourselves, including food, right? Food is one of those basic kinds of property that we then make part of our bodies by consuming it. And of course, our own bodies are our property too. So life, liberty, and property, meaning that nobody else has the right to interfere with my rights to my life, my freedom, and my possessions, the things that I own. And we have an obligation morally to respect other people's rights as well. All right, so this might make it a little bit of a challenge for going back to the littering example. What right has this person violated, right? And does this person have the right to drop a candy wrapper on the parking lot? Does a person have such a right? Is she interfering with anybody's liberty? Not really. Is she interfering with anybody's property? Well, there perhaps, because she is on public property in this parking lot. Or some parking lots, I guess, are actually a lot of parking lots are private property. Either way, whether it's public property or private property, she is misusing somebody else's property. Or if it's public property, she's misusing all of our property, our shared common property. So there is a natural rights case as well against a person littering. Sorry, I guess I just divulged that it was a Vimo who's dropping it. It's neither here nor there. Okay, next moral theory that we can look at is sometimes called utilitarianism. Utilitarianism. So utilitarianism adopts the principle that whatever maximizes happiness in general for everybody, in other words, whatever does the greater good for everybody considered, is what's morally right. And whatever minimizes happiness or whatever causes suffering is morally wrong. Now we're considering everybody there. So it's almost like one of the earliest proponents of utilitarianism was a philosopher named Jeremy Bentham. Bentham thought that this is almost like a kind of a mathematical accounting. We could add up the amount of happiness that something would bring society, and we could subtract the amount of suffering or pain or discomfort an action would bring to society. And when we do that, we end up with what Bentham called a philosophic calculus. We end up with some kind of mathematical way of determining what's morally right, because we could determine what makes the most people happy or what adds pleasure to the most people, what is the greatest good, and then we could also quantify what would cause the most suffering. Run the numbers, and then we end up with a fairly good guide or fairly good method for consistently determining what's morally right. That's the utilitarian model. Now, of course, one of the challenges with the utilitarian model, by the way, I haven't focused on the challenges of all these models, but even the cognitive moral theories, which we are reviewing now, even those have problems associated with them. There are counterexamples. There are some minor discrepancies. Sorry, you might hear my cat meowing here. There are minor discrepancies. There are usually exceptions to many of these moral rules that we might have. No moral theory is absolutely airtight and absolute. However, one thing that I do want to say at this point, and I should have said this at the beginning, but I'll try to say it again at the conclusion of this video. As difficult as it is to determine which moral theory is absolutely right and applicable everywhere, that's a challenge. But there are many cases where we could say that according to all the major cognitive moral theories, something might be morally wrong or morally right. If a lot of the theories generally kind of coalesce and agree that something is morally right or required, or something is morally wrong, then we have a strong argument for something being genuinely morally wrong. Right? Again, it has to do with logic. It has to do with consistency in the use of these moral principles that I'm describing, the use of these moral theories. All right, so we've talked about utilitarianism. We've got two more to review. One of them, the next one, is sometimes called Kantianism because it was developed by an 18th century philosopher named Immanuel Kant. Kant argued that that we should be logically consistent in thinking about our duties to other people and thinking about whether something is universalizable. Now, there are lots of different ways in which Kant argued for his duty-based moral theory, but I want to focus here on the idea of universalizability. Kant points out that anytime we perform an action, anytime we do something, we are implying that we think that that is okay to do. We are implying that the action is acceptable. And Kant thinks this is necessary. It's necessarily the case, because if I do something, then I must think that that's okay. All right. In other words, hypocrisy is out. Hypocrisy means that I do something, but I don't think it's okay. But Kant says that's a contradiction right off the bat, and we can dismiss that. So whatever I do, that means I think it's morally right. Well, that means also, if I think that it's morally right, that means I also have to be okay with anybody else doing it too, right? So if I litter, for example, then I'm declaring that littering is morally acceptable. That also means that I need to be okay with anybody else littering, right? Okay, so Kant then expands that, and he develops from that, he derives from that this idea of universalizability. Is this action universalizable? Could I live in a world, or would I want to live in a world, where anybody could do this and it would be morally fine? So Kant's, for example, here's another one, stealing, right? Could I live in a world where stealing is morally fine? Let's say I steal something from somebody, right? I have basically declared that stealing is acceptable, right? At least in that case. Well, but generally, there's more to it. So I've declared that stealing is okay. That means that I've permitted anybody else from stealing, anybody else to steal from me. Action for Kant is permission. Right? So action is permission. So could I universalize littering? I couldn't, because I would not want to live in a world where people could just litter willy-nilly. So that's why I should not litter, and that's also why this woman should not litter. She would not want to live in a world where people could just litter willy-nilly. Right? Okay. Finally, last moral theory that we'll go over, and I know this video is getting kind of long, but I hope that you enjoy these interesting ways of thinking about moral decision making and making moral arguments. Right? Again, all of these moral theories are for the sake of being able to identify principles that can help us to make moral arguments, right? Logical moral arguments. So, final moral theory: virtue ethics. So, what virtue ethics focuses on is not so much on actions. Virtue focuses on character. Virtue focuses on the sorts of traits that lead to certain actions. Right? So I can start with, you could probably make a long list of virtues, things like personality traits or character traits, habits that you would say are virtuous. I'll name the cardinal virtues, what are sometimes called the major four virtues, based on some tradition. And I think you'll find these are all very virtuous. One of them is courage. Courage is one of the cardinal virtues, sometimes called fortitude or strength, right? Do you have the strength to do things that are a little bit risky but important, right? So there's a possibility that you might be harmed, sometimes even killed, based on an act. However, you are brave enough to do it because you feel as though, and you are confident that the outcome, that what you're being courageous towards is right, right? So virtue ethics focuses on that. Virtue ethics also looks at moderation, right? So usually the way that we can identify virtues is by taking two extremes and kind of looking for where there is something in the middle, some sort of golden mean. Let me use the courage example. This is a classic example of elaborating on and developing or deriving virtue ethics. If I think about the situation where I'm in a dangerous environment and there are people who need to be rescued or helped, right? There is one way. I'm going to try to use the scale so that one side is low, and I'm not sure how this is going to turn out. But in one respect, I could lack courage, right? So if I lack courage, if I have a deficit of courage, then we might call that cowardice, right? So or fear. So in that case, when there's an environment where people's lives are in danger, including my own, and I could help some people, but it requires a little bit of courage. But I lack that courage, I will not end up helping anybody, right? So that's a vice, right? Cowardice is a vice. But let's go all the way to the other side of the spectrum. Let's go to the extreme on the other direction. The extreme in the other direction is brashness, where I foolishly enter a dangerous environment and just end up, say, getting myself killed or hurt anyway, without really helping anybody else or accomplishing the purpose for which I set out to take action, or yeah, cool, that led me to take action in the first place. Well, that's all the way at the other extreme. Virtue ethics tries to say, is there something between these two vices, that where there is some kind of like positive character trait in the middle? And usually that's the case. There's a deficit of this character trait in cowardice. There's an excess when we're thinking about brashness. All right, so that's hopefully a helpful overview of 10 moral theories. Most of them, the last 6 we've gone over, are cognitive moral theories because they seek consistency. They seek uh, they seek the ability to form a logically coherent argument, right, based on them. And the other non-cognitive ones, or sometimes authoritarian ones, do not. They could change from one moment to the next, from one culture to the next, from one person to the next, from one religion to the next, from one interpretation of religion to the next, from one period of time to the next, as religions kind of grow and develop and splinter and have new interpretations. And of course, the other non-cognitive moral theory we talked about was emotivism at the very beginning, where whatever my emotions say is right or wrong, well, that's what I'll go with. Your emotions can change from one moment to the next. You might develop as a person. Does that mean that it was wrong before? But right now, there's not a consistent moral framework that we can develop from emotivism. All right. So I hope this has been a helpful overview of some of the moral theories and how we can use them to make moral arguments. The primary case that I've been using for most of them has been the case of somebody littering on public property, but I'm sure you can see how applicable they are and how broadly applicable they are in making moral decisions and solving moral problems, making moral arguments that will support certain kinds of behavior and certain kinds of actions, certain kinds of personality traits. Thanks so much for watching if you made it all the way to this end, and I hope this has helped you grow and learn.